Tom lived alone at the edge of the scraplands where the sand met rusted towers of twisted metal and broken starship bones. Everything around him was silent except for the wind that carried dust and the occasional creak of a loosened panel shifting. Under the weight of time, his days passed in routine: wake up, boil recycled water, check solar panels, dig through the ruins for anything that still held value. He never spoke, not because he couldn't, but because there was no one to speak. Too long ago he had come to this place to leave the noise of civilization behind, the wars, the betrayals, the failures. Now he spent each day in quiet labor, repurposing forgotten things. He found comfort in the solitude and the predictability of rust and heat and silence. But one evening something changed. It started with a vibration, a low trembling in the ground at first. Tom thought it was another sand tremor, a small quake that sometimes shifted the junk piles. But this one felt different. It carried a rhythm not of the earth but of the sky. Then a shadow streaked across the orange twilight, a glimmering pod trailing smoke and fire breaking through the atmosphere with desperate speed. It crashed not far from where he stood, vanishing behind a wall of scrap and dust. Tom didn't hesitate. He grabbed his toolkit slung on his shoulder and ran through narrow corridors of metal slabs and melted wiring. His boots crunched over shattered glass and ash. The sky was darker, now heavy with the settling smoke from the crash. He found the pod wedged between two broken engines, one side caved in sparks jumping from the hull, and the door half melted. The kind of damage that said it had come in too fast, that it was never meant to land here. Inside, through the cracked viewport, he saw movement, small and slow. He pried the door open, using the metal bar, forcing it to bend enough for him to reach in. The air was hot inside. The pod smelled of smoke and burnt wiring, and under a blanket of thermal foil lay a small figure, shaking arms curled close, breathing shallow. She didn't look human. Her skin was a pale gray, not from illness but naturally smooth and silken, and her eyes, large and glassy, were open wide with fear. Her limbs were thin, her fingers long and delicate, and there were tiny ridges along her forehead, almost like natural markings. She stared at him with terror, frozen, unable to move. When he reached forward gently, trying not to startle her, she flinched and made a sound soft like a chirp of warning. But Tom had seen fear before. He knew it well. So he spoke slowly, his voice low, not to scare her, telling her it was okay, that she was safe now, even though he knew she couldn't understand him. Still, he offered his hand, and after a long moment of stillness, she reached out and took at her hand, trembling but willing. He wrapped her carefully in the thermal foil and lifted her from the pod. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel the heat from her body fading fast. She was fading. He didn't think twice. He ran back through the maze of junk, his steps quick and uneven, metal clanging under his feet, back to his small shelter built from steel sheets and container walls, the roof patched with old satellite dishes, and the door a rusted ramp he had salvaged years ago. Inside, he laid her on the softest thing he had, an old mattress stuffed with fabric scraps, and covered her with a layer of blankets, then turned on the heater, a salvaged plasma coil that buzzed to life with a dim red glow. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stared at the ceiling, unblinking, her lips slightly parted, as if trying to understand where she was, what was happening, who this man was. Tom boiled water, mixed it with nutrient powder, and slowly helped her drink. She struggled at first, not knowing the taste or purpose, but then drank more. She was too weak to resist anything, too tired to ask questions. That night, Tom sat by the heater, watching her, breathing steady but shallow. He didn't sleep. He didn't try. Something about the way she looked reminded him of a time he had buried deep in his memory, a time when he had failed to save someone, a time when help had come too late. He would not let that happen again. By morning, she had stirred, her fingers twitching, her eyes finding him and staying on him, watching cautiously but no longer terrified, just unsure. He spoke to her again, slowly repeating small words, pointing to things, saying their names, trying to make a connection. She did not answer, but she listened. He showed her a small tool, a wrench, then gave it to her. She turned it in her fingers, studied it, her brow furrowed in curiosity. Not fear anymore. Days passed like this. Each day Tom left for a few hours to gather supplies, always returning with something new, a piece of cloth, a solar lamp, a wire coil. And each night he used those scraps to improve the shelter, making it warmer, safer, adding small touches for her comfort, patting the walls with fabric hanging soft lights above her bed, arranging things in a way that made the place feel less like a bunker and more like a home. She began to move more, to sit up, to explore her surroundings, still cautious, but less afraid. Sometimes she would mimic his actions. If he picked up a tool, she would too. If he repaired a wire, she would watch closely and try to understand. They had no common language, but they found ways to speak. Through gestures, sounds, nods, and smiles. One evening, as the sky turned violet and the stars blinked over the horizon, she sat next to him outside the shelter. She pointed up to the stars, then drew a shape in the dirt with her finger. A circle with 3 points, like a star map or a symbol of something she remembered. Tom didn't know what it meant, but he nodded. He understood it was home, or what used to be. And she looked at him with eyes that were no longer empty, and he saw something in them. Trust, hope, maybe even belonging. Didn't know where she had come from or who she had lost or what had destroyed her ship. But he knew one thing clearly: she had fallen into his world like a silent wish from the sky. And now she was not alone. He would build a place where she could heal, a place she could call home, even if he had to build it out of nothing but rust and scrap and time. And maybe, just maybe, in giving her a home, he would find one. 2 mornings in the scraplands always arrived slowly, the light creeping in through clouds of dust and settling over hills of rusted wreckage. Like a soft, forgotten memory, the wind would whisper through hollow pipes and bent antennas. And somewhere deep in the maze of metal, a man rose from his simple bed, careful not to wake the girl who still slept, wrapped in warmth she had never known before. Tom stretched his arms, stiff from days of labor and silence, but inside him something had shifted. A quiet urgency had taken root. Ever since he had carried the lost girl into his shelter, the space no longer felt like his alone. It had begun to change, not in size but in purpose. He moved with a sense of quiet determination, not rushing, but never idle either. Outside, the sun was already beginning to warm the top layer of steel sheets, and he stepped into the yard where he kept his salvage neatly sorted by shape and type, a habit learned over years of living with nothing but broken things. Today, he needed to build her a real place, not just a mattress in a corner, but a space of her own, a place that didn't feel temporary. He looked at the scattered remains of old escape pods, broken satellite dishes, fractured hull plates, and wiring bundles. None of it was beautiful, none of it looked like home, but in his mind he saw something more. He began selecting parts, carefully dragging over panels, cutting pieces with a plasma blade that hummed with tired energy, attaching pieces with bolts and melted joints. Using his hands to measure every angle, the structure grew slowly, walls rising from scrap, a frame forming from beams once used in cargo haulers, now serving as bones for something new. He worked all morning, and through the heat of the day, sweat rolling down his back, grease streaked on his face, pausing only to drink from his recycled water tank or check on the girl through the open hatch. She was sitting up now, watching him with wide eyes, her head tilted slightly, like she was trying to understand the shape of what he was making. When he saw her gaze, he smiled, a rare curve of his mouth, and motioned for her to come closer. She stood carefully, legs still weak but steadier than before, and walked toward him, one step at a time, not like someone afraid anymore, but like someone curious and cautious. She reached the edge of the work area and stood there watching as he welded a section of the wall into place. He looked at her, then pointed to a nearby crate filled with metal rings and small panels, and nodded slowly. She followed his gesture, looked at the parts, then back at him, unsure but willing. He handed her a piece of metal, small, light, with tiny holes, and showed her how to align it on the frame. She tried mimicking his motions, her fingers trembling slightly, but she managed to slide the piece into place. He gave her a nod of approval, and she responded with the faintest smile. From that moment she began helping more, handing tools, holding panels, pressing wires into place, Guided by nothing but his patient gestures and her own growing confidence, they said no words. But their rhythm matched slowly. Their actions became a kind of quiet language. As the shelter rose, so did something between them, something deeper than simple survival inside the main hut. Tom cleared a small section and began preparing additions for her. He shaped a chair from bent tubing and an old pilot seat. He cleaned out a rusted cabinet and lined it with soft cloth and light from a solar bulb that he adjusted until it glowed with a soft blue hue. He remembered how her eyes had widened when she first saw color in the dark, and now he wanted her space to feel like comfort, not just safety. In the evenings they sat outside the new room. Still unfinished but already standing strong against the wind, she would sit beside him, knees pulled close, watching the horizon where fallen towers cast long shadows. And sometimes she would hum a soft sound, repeating in a slow rhythm. A song perhaps, or just something she remembered from before. He never interrupted her, never asked, he only listened. And sometimes nodded as if he understood the meaning, even if he didn't. Tone. Night, while he was repairing a corner joint, she tapped his arm gently, then pointed upward. The stars had begun to appear. She lifted her hand and traced a shape in the sky, connecting invisible lines between lights. Tom watched as she drew the same pattern she had made before, a circle with 3 points. He still didn't know what it meant, but he reached down into his toolbox and pulled out a broken panel with a smooth surface, then handed her a small piece of chalk he had found long ago. She looked at him puzzled, and he nodded again. Slowly placing her hand on the panel, she understood then, and began drawing the same symbol, this time slowly with care, her eyes fixed on the image as if the memory was precious and fragile. When she finished, she held the panel close and placed it inside the shelter beside her bed. Tom saw the way she treated that simple scrap, not as garbage, but as something valuable. And in that moment, he realized the shelter was not just for her. It was a piece of her past anchored to this place. Not everything around them was still. Across the distant hills of metal, beyond the silence and scrap, other eyes were watching. Group of scavengers had spotted movement near Tom's territory, something they hadn't seen in months. And they didn't like surprises. They spoke in hushed voices among themselves, wondering if he had found something rare, something worth stealing. One of them recognized the shape of the escape pod, the markings barely visible from afar, and whispered that it looked like a diplomatic vessel. Not a common ship, and definitely not something meant for these parts. They grew curious and hungry with greed. Back at the shelter, Tom was sealing the final wall when he felt a cold prickle in the air. Not from temperature, but from instinct. Something had shifted in the silence. He scanned the horizon but saw nothing, only shadows, long and twisted. He turned back to the shelter and saw her standing in the doorway watching him, and for a moment, he felt a sense of calm, even with the unknown creeping toward them. Would protect this place. He would protect her, even if the world outside had forgotten. Kindness he would not anymore. The shelter was not just metal and wires. It was trust. It was memory. It was beginning. And in the quiet between stars and scrap, they had found something stronger than fear. The days in the scraplands had begun to change. Not in weather or light, but in feeling. Where silence had once lived, now there was motion and color, the kind that didn't come from the sun or the sand, but from two beings finding comfort in each other's presence. Tom had finished the girls' shelter. It stood beside his own, made from forgotten metals and broken parts, but shaped with care and purpose. The walls were strong, the floor lined with soft padding from old supply crates, and stitched fabric. The roof had a slight curve, just enough to keep out the harsh wind, and inside hung small lights that blinked gently like fireflies. The girl had made it her own in small, quiet ways, arranging things with her own sense of pattern, placing her drawing panel in the corner, placing smooth stones she had found on the ground along the windowsill, organizing tools and wire scraps into neat rows, not for use, but maybe for the way they looked, or maybe because she had once seen order in something that was now lost. She had started to speak, not with full sentences, but with words she had learned from Tom, simple ones, like warm and water and sky. She had her own words. Two soft ones with gentle tones. Sometimes she would say one and tap her chest, then look at Tom until he nodded as if trying to learn. Sometimes she laughed. It was rare but real, and it filled the space between them like music. Tom had not heard that sound in many years, and each time it echoed in his shelter, he found himself smiling without meaning to, the kind of smile that reached the eyes even when the face had long forgotten how to move. One afternoon, while sorting through old radio parts, Tom found a small device once used to store music. He cleaned it, repaired a broken circuit, powered it through solar cells, and connected it to a speaker. The sound was rough at first, static mixed with melody. But when the girl heard it, she froze, then sat down cross-legged, her hands on her knees, listening with full attention. She didn't move for a long time, her eyes closed as if remembering something, as if the notes pulled memories from deep inside, where they had been hiding. That evening she surprised Tom by humming the tune back, slower, softer, but matching the rhythm perfectly. She did not smile, but she looked at him and nodded once. It was her way of saying she understood. Or maybe she was saying, "Thank you." They began working together, more not just on repairs or building, but on creating small things. He showed her how to shape scrap into forms using heat and pressure. Together, they built a small wind spinner, which she placed outside her shelter. It turned with each breeze, catching light and shadow in shifting patterns. Every morning she helped collect supplies. Every evening she helped sort them. Tom would find her sometimes lost in her thoughts, sitting at the edge of their small home, drawing new symbols into the dirt, or tracing stars with her fingers. And though she still didn't tell her story, he began to see it in the way she moved, with quiet grace, as though she had once belonged to something peaceful and grand, and now carried that echo in her bones. But peace never lasted long in the scraplands. One day, while gathering spare wire near the far edge of his territory, Tom saw movement. Not metal, not wind, but people. 3 figures walking low and fast through the wrecks, heads turning, eyes scanning. It was not the first time he had seen scavengers, but something about these ones felt different, sharper, more focused. He returned quickly, told the girl to stay inside, to keep quiet. Her eyes widened at the change in his voice. She understood, even if she didn't know the words. He prepared what little defense he had hidden. Panels, thick doors, tools turned into weapons. That evening, just as the sun dipped behind the twisted ruins, they came closer. 2 stayed back, while one stepped forward, tall, with a burnt jacket and eyes that held no patience. The man said he had seen something unusual near this place. Said he heard rumors of a crash, something not from this world, something rare and valuable. Tom said nothing. The man looked past him toward the shelter, then smiled, the kind of smile that meant trouble. Said he didn't want conflict, just a trade, maybe just a look, just confirmation. Still Tom said nothing. The girl stayed hidden, but Tom knew they would not leave without a reason. Later that night, the girl placed her hand on Tom's arm, looked him in the eyes, then pointed to the roof. She wanted to help, not hide, not run. She understood danger, not as fear, but as something that must be faced. Tom hesitated, but then nodded. They began working on defenses, turning the scrapyard into a barrier, adding motion triggers and alarm signals, rigging old circuits to flash lights or release bursts of noise. The girl proved quick with her hands, knowing how to connect strange devices with ease. Maybe a skill from her world, maybe instinct. Tom watched her work with silent pride, never saying the words but feeling them deeply. She was no longer a guest, no longer a burden. She was part of this place, part of his world. As night came and the wind howled across the rusted plains, Tom sat outside, watching the stars. The girl joined him, quietly sat beside him, leaned her head against his shoulder. Neither spoke, but in that silence, something passed between them. Something that didn't need to be named. He remembered what it felt like to lose, and he remembered what it felt like to be alone. But now, beside this strange girl with quiet strength, he felt something else. He felt like someone who mattered again. And in the heart of the junk and ruin, under stars that whispered of distant homes, a man and a girl, not of the same kind, began to feel like family. They were not safe yet, and they were not finished, but they were. Not alone, not anymore. Tom woke before the light touched the sky. The air was cool and heavy, carrying the weight of tension. Like a silent warning, even the wind seemed slower, cautious, as if the land itself had sensed what was coming. He stepped outside, looked toward the far end of the scrap horizon where twisted towers of metal leaned against each other, and shadows moved just out of sight. The girl stood nearby, already awake, already alert, her hands clutching a wire spool, her eyes following his with the same question he carried in his chest. Would they come today? Would they bring noise and fire and ruin to the home they had built piece by piece with patience and hope? They had no army, no allies, no wall of steel or drones to guard them. Just piles of forgotten machines, and the will to stand. Tom set to work without speaking, not because words were missing, but because they were not needed. He had already planned it in his mind for nights leading up to this moment. Each step, each part, each piece of junk now had purpose. Dragged thick panels from the deeper stacks, rusted, but strong enough to deflect light rounds, and reinforce them with layers of mesh wire and engine casing, turning the open front into a narrow passage. The girl followed with smaller parts, rods, gears, old vent tubing, which they bolted into shapes that curved like shields around the door. Old energy coils were repurposed into heat traps placed beneath the sand and covered with plates, so that anyone who stepped wrong would feel a blast of sudden heat, strong enough to send a warning without needing to kill. Tom rewired broken light poles, turned them into sensors, their tips glowing faintly once connected to a charge line running along the outer wall. He showed the girl how they worked, pointed to the sparks, explained with hand motions how the lights would flicker if anyone came close. She nodded once, then added a line of her own, a strange sequence of small black discs lined up on the edge of the path, connected by a silver thread. He didn't know where she had learned to make them or what they did, but he trusted her. Inside the shelters, they rearranged everything, moved supplies, tools, water, and food to a smaller hidden compartment under the floor, covered with cloth and scrap in case they needed to disappear quickly. They didn't speak much that day, but every glance, every gesture carried meaning. As the sun rose higher and the heat returned to its usual sharpness, they kept working, layering the space between their shelters with junk arranged, not as clutter, but as cover, places to move, hide, defend. They added height where they could, stacking parts until they created a tower just high enough for a clear view of the land beyond. From that point they could see the path the scavengers would likely take. It was narrow, surrounded by wreckage, and perfect for slowing anyone who came with hostile intent. By evening, everything was in place. The light turned soft and red, and the girl sat near the corner of her shelter, watching the sky, the way she often did when she missed something far away. Tom sat beside her, placed an old metal cup in her hand filled with water. He nodded toward the tower, then toward her. Her gaze followed the motion, and she smiled just barely. But it was there. Night fell, but neither of them slept. The stars blinked overhead, countless and quiet. The wind picked up now, faster, colder, sharper, carrying the scent of machines and smoke, faint but growing. Tom stood on the tower, watching the shadows below. They moved, slow but steady, shapes of men carrying packs and weapons, lit faintly by the glow of their pathfinders, scavengers hungry for salvage, and maybe for the girl. They came closer until the edge of the traps. One man stepped forward too quick and triggered the heat coil. His shout echoed across the scrap, a sharp cry of pain and confusion. They scattered a moment, lost in surprise, then gathered again, more cautious now. They tried another path, but the girl's discs lit up in a sudden shimmer of light, and a sharp crack. The silver thread sparked bright, and the invaders fell back, blinking, covering their eyes. Tom knew they wouldn't retreat, not yet. They were curious, and greed did not walk away from what it could not understand. He climbed down from the tower and took position behind the front barrier, his hands steady, his heart slow. He had fought before, he had lost before, but tonight something was different. This fight was not for revenge or survival. This fight was for someone he had grown to care about, someone who had brought warmth to his cold quiet Whirled the scavengers reached the wall and shouted offers, threats, promises to trade to leave in peace, if only they could see the girl. Tom said nothing. They tried to push forward, stepping into the narrow path where they met the second line of defense. Scrap traps designed to collapse and pull weight down the path crumbled under them, dragging one into a pit. The others pulled back again, now yelling with anger. From behind the side barrier, the girl released a flash device. It was small, shaped like a sphere made from old comms equipment. When it hit the ground, it released a sound sharp like broken glass, and a pulse of white light. The invaders stumbled. Tom used that moment to step forward, not to fight but to stand tall in the path where they could see him alone, arms wide, silent, the message clear: you will not pass. There was a pause, then silence, then footsteps. Retreating fast, stumbling through their own panic, the metal underfoot singing with the sound of their fear. Then nothing. The wind returned soft again. Tom stood for a moment, then turned and saw the girl waiting near the shelter, her eyes on his, as if asking, is it over? He nodded slowly, his breath finally leaving his chest in a long, quiet exhale. They walked back into the shelter without speaking, sat by the heater, lit only by the small lamp in the corner, and shared a piece of dried food. Neither of them tasted much, but it didn't matter tonight. They had defended their home, not because it was built from walls and wires, but because it was built with trust and care and quiet love that did not need to be named. Tom looked at her across the room and saw not a lost alien girl, but someone who had chosen to stay, someone who had chosen him. And in that moment, beneath a roof made of scrap and sky, he realized this was no longer just a shelter. This was their fortress, their bond, their beginning. The morning after the fight arrived with golden light spreading over the wrecked land like a quiet promise. The wind moved softer, brushing across the hills of twisted metal, as if the scrap itself had exhaled and returned to rest. Tom stood outside the shelter, staring at the land around him. No invaders, no noise, only silence that no longer felt empty. The air was warmer, not because the sun burned brighter, but because something deep within had changed. The girl came out not long after, her feet bare, her steps light. She walked up beside him, her head tilted slightly, the way she often did when reading the world with her quiet eyes. They looked over their home, not as something broken and patched, but as something they had built together, something that had held strong when it was tested. Tom turned and began clearing the damage left from the night. The scorched sand, the shifted panels, the bits of old metal that had fallen loose. He worked with steady hands, not rushed, not tired, just calm. The girl joined him, without asking, her fingers quick as always, sorting parts, stacking debris, checking wires, and picking out what could still be used. They didn't need to speak. Their work had become its own language. As the sun climbed higher, they began to rebuild, not to restore the same walls, but to reshape their space into something more. Tom found a wide panel from a collapsed satellite dish and cut it into a curved awning, which they placed above the doorway for shade. The girl arranged colored wires and small reflective plates along its edge, so that sunlight bounced off it in quiet, shifting colors like tiny rainbows. Inside the shelter, they replaced the broken lights with new ones built from scavenged lenses and power cells taken from old drones. Now the room glowed in soft blue and gold, and in the middle, they placed a small table welded from pipe and steel, flat and solid, with two round stones resting in the center. One dark, one pale, placed side by side, without explanation. Each day after that, they worked on more than just defense. They worked on comfort. They built shelves from old crates and filled them with useful tools and strange shapes the girl had shaped from scrap. She started painting patterns on the walls, simple ones, repeating curves and dots and lines like stories from another world. Tom built a tall pole in the center of their yard and fixed a signal dish to the top, not to call for rescue, but to send a message clear and steady across the stars. Not words, but a tone, a repeating sound like a heartbeat, telling anyone listening that this place was alive, that someone here had survived and found peace. The girl added to the signal a small device she had hidden since her crash. It fit in her hand like a smooth stone. When activated, it pulsed once, then began to glow faint green. She looked at Tom and nodded, then placed it at the base of the pole. Her message now joined with his days. Past the land remained quiet. The scavengers did not return, and the sky above brought only wind and stars. Tom planted a small row of seed pods he had kept for years without hope, and for the first time, he watered them with care, not just habit. The girl watched, then knelt beside him and placed her hand on the soil, then smiled a soft, silent smile that said she believed something might grow here. One evening, as the stars blinked to life above them, a new light appeared, faint at first, then growing stronger. A small ship descending, not fast, not in flames, but in calm control. It hovered above the far edge of the scraplands, and then landed with a soft thud, sending dust into the air. Tom stood still, his heart steady but alert. The girl stepped beside him. Her hand brushed his, then fell to her side. They waited as the ship opened slowly, and two figures stepped out, their shapes strange, but not hostile. Their movements careful, their eyes searching. The girl walked forward slowly. The figures did the same. No weapons, no words, just quiet steps. They met halfway under the starlight and stood in silence. Then one of the newcomers reached out, touched the girl's shoulder, and placed a small object in her hand, a disc with the same symbol she had once drawn in the dirt. She looked back at Tom, her eyes uncertain, as if asking if this was a goodbye. He walked to her slowly, stopped beside her, then reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder, the way she had done once when he had been the one unsure. He gave a slow nod, not of permission, but of understanding. But she did not step into the ship. She turned back toward the shelter, then pointed to the sky, then to her heart, then to the ground beneath them. The newcomers watched, then stepped back slowly, as if they understood she had chosen her place. Ship rose again quietly and vanished into the stars, leaving behind only dust and the echo of something ending, or maybe beginning. Tom and the girl walked back to the shelter. No words, no questions, only the soft rhythm of their steps in the dust. That night she spoke in full, her voice quiet but steady. She said one word at a time, carefully, "I stay here. This is home. You are home." Tom closed his eyes for a moment, felt the weight of those words sink into him, not heavy, not painful, but full, the kind of full that comes when something long empty is finally whole. Time past the shelter became more than a shelter. It became a beacon. Other travelers found it, some broken, some lost, all welcomed. Each helped in their own way, building, adding, painting, planning. The junkyard turned to a village, shaped by many hands but rooted in two. The girl grew stronger, her language became clearer, her knowledge deeper. She taught others, helped fix machines, showed how to use broken things to create new ones. Tom watched it all from his quiet corner, sometimes helping, sometimes resting, but always there. When people asked where it all began, she would tell them simply, "A man found me in the dust and built me a home from scrap, and in that home I found the stars again." The end.